Hello everyone, I'm Mrs. Princey, Associate Professor in Mental Health Nursing. Each and every one of us in our lifetime, come across an emergency situation or we can say a crisis situation which requires an immediate, help or, intervention. This crisis situation, some of us will be able to cope up with it. Some of us may find it difficult to cope up with the situation, or some of them will not be able to cope up with the situation, ending with the emotional or behavioral problems. So, this kind of a crisis situation can also not only lower the function of a person, but also it can enhance the functionality of a person, because a crisis situation becomes a challenging situation for an individual to face, and to overcome the challenges again, it is going to improve the functionality of a person. So it can either cause a decrease in the functionality, or the individual may be able to function at the same level what he was functioning before, or it can cause a higher level of functioning in a person. That means he may better function than the previous level, because he has take it as a challenge and he has successfully overcome the crisis. So any situation that he faces in his life, he will take it as a challenge and he will be able to face it and function in a better way. Right. So the topic which I'm going to discuss today is about the crisis. Let us see the definition of crisis. Crisis is any temporary situation that threatens the self-concept of a person. It is a temporary period, or it is a temporary situation which happens in the life of a person. Crisis is not permanent, right? So it is happening for a short period of time. So it is a temporary situation which will have an impact on the self-concept of an individual, which necessitates the reorganization of psychological structure and behavior. Yes, so this kind of a crisis situation makes a person to reorganize his psychological structure or behavior. Yes, based on the situation, even our behavior will change, right? So it makes a person, or it necessitates the person to have a change, or to have a reorganization in his psychological structure or the behavior. And also it causes a sudden alteration in the person's expectation of self. Yes, so all of it was going on smoothly, but suddenly there is a crisis situation which happens, which requires a person to alter his expectation of self, right? So he will be in such a situation that he himself should be able to accept his self to face the particular situation. And this kind of a situation, it cannot be handled with the usual coping mechanism which a person will use. Yes, each and every person, whenever there is a stress, we use the coping mechanism, we try to overcome the particular stress. But during a crisis situation, the usual coping mechanisms which we have, or which we have learned, unconsciously or consciously, we will use this coping mechanisms. But this usual coping mechanism which an individual will use, that will not be helpful to overcome the crisis situation, right? So this is what is the definition of the crisis. So let me just tell you what is this definition I've explained. It is any temporary situation that threatens the self-concept of the person, which necessitates the person to have a reorganization in the psychological structure as well as behavior, causes a sudden alteration in the person's expectation of the self, and this cannot be handled by the person's usual coping mechanisms. So this is the definition given by Kaplan 1964. So let us see what are the characteristics of crisis. So when I say the crisis, so what are those characteristics of the crisis? The first one is During the crisis situation, the individual is totally involved. Yes. So, whenever the person or an individual comes across a crisis situation, he is totally involved in it. It is not that, a part of it is physically he is there, mentally he is not, into the situation. No, he is totally involved into the situation, can be related to the physical or psychological, spiritual, all the areas of a person is totally involved in the crisis situation. The second one is a crisis is an unexpected situation or a scenario. Yes, anybody will not expect certain things to happen unless and until there are some situational events or the anticipated crisis, we can say. Yes, for example, anticipated crisis, say there is an elderly person or an old age person or around 80 or 85 years old is having some medical disorders. Yes, say for example cancer. So doctor would have already given a idea that this is the lifespan of this person. So in those situations we can expect that any time the person can die. So that kind of a crisis situation is different, but majority of crisis situation are unexpected, right? See, for example, even if you take this COVID-19 pandemic, we never thought that it would impact the society at such a level, right? So crisis is an unexpected situation. The individual would not expect that this can happen. Or you say, for example, accident, right? An accident is an unexpected crisis situation, right? So any crisis you take, majority of the crisis situation will be unexpected. Okay, so that is the second characteristic. The third one is it creates uncertainty. So what is it? Uncertainty, right? So you do not know what may happen, right? You are not in a position to understand or predict what can happen in the future. So because of the crisis situation, a person will not be able to decide or will not be able to imagine what may be the consequence or what things can happen. So he will be so much uncertain about the events which can happen post crisis. So the third characteristic is it creates the uncertainty. The next characteristic is the crisis is a threat to important goals. Yes, each and every person in the life has a goal, has got a purpose, right? So whenever there is a crisis situation, it is going to have an impact on the goal of a person. It threatens or it avoids a person to reach the particular goal or to fulfill his purpose. So any crisis situation can also threaten the important goals of a person. It can be a lifetime goal or it can be a very simple goal. So whatsoever, maybe it is an important goal for a person. So such a kind of a goal can be a threat when there is a crisis situation. Next one is it occurs in all the individual, right? So it is not limited that only it is related to male gender or a female gender. It happens only in children or it happens only in old age or it happens in the younger age. No, it happens in all the individual irrespective of age, gender, any medical disorders. No, right? So any individual may be at risk of facing a crisis situation anytime in their life. Crisis is personal by nature. Yes, each and every individual crisis situation, some of them will be able to overcome it easily or some of them may not overcome the crisis at all, right? So it is personal in nature. Each individual perceives or understands or takes up the crisis in a different way. You can say each individual is different when he reacts to a crisis situation. So it is personal by nature. A crisis situation is acute, self-limiting and lasts for about 4 to 6 weeks. So any crisis situation, it is a acute situation. Acute in a sense which happens suddenly, which is for a temporary period lasting for short period of time, right? And also it is self-limiting in a sense, you given a time, say many crisis situation to overcome, maximum it may take 1 to 1.5 months, 4 weeks to 6 weeks, a person may take time to overcome the crisis, but it is self-limiting. For majority of people who are having a very strong coping mechanism, who are having a good support system, within 4 to 6 weeks, the person will be able to overcome the crisis. So it is a self-limiting, doesn't require a medical, personnel or a psychiatric personnel for the intervention, right? So it is a short-lived. Say for example, there is a death in the family. Yes, the whole family is in a crisis situation. Yes, so it takes time for the family to overcome the grief, right? A process of grief, we can say. Yes, it takes maybe 15 days or 1 month to overcome the grief process or the crisis situation. But later on, they feel it very normal. Everything will start functioning in a normal way. So majority of the crisis situation takes about 4 to 6 weeks to just get resolved by its own self. Crisis is a universal experience. So what do you mean by universal experience? It is not related to only a single individual, as I told you before, or a particular region or particular gender. It is universal. Anywhere you go around the world, you can see people who end up with crisis or who face the crisis situation. So it is a universal phenomena, or it is a universal experience. Everybody around the world will experience the crisis. Crisis is potential for psychological growth or retardation or dangerous to a person. So what is it? Okay, so this characteristic says that a crisis situation is potential for a growth of a person, right? So if a person takes up the crisis situation as a challenge, he will be able to overcome and he will be very strong. So he will grow or he will have a higher functionality. So that is why we can say that crisis leads to psychological growth or emotional growth of a person, or it can even cause psychological retardation, right? Some of them will not be able to overcome the crisis, can cause the retardation, can end up with the emotional disorders or behavioral disorders, or it can destroy even the person in terms of ending up with various psychiatric emergencies. Say for example, suicide. Okay, so it is a dangerous thing which happens to a person. So any crisis situation, it is potential for a psychological growth or a psychological retardation, or even it can destroy the person. Okay, so these are some of the important characteristics of the crisis. Moving on to the types of crisis. So what are the various types of crisis? Yes, we have got different types. So number one, we have the situational crisis, otherwise it is called as the external crisis, or we can say coincidental crisis. As the name says, situational, so it happens during a particular situation. So this kind of a crisis in response to sudden unexpected event in the person's life, right? So there are many events which we cannot even expect when such a kind of an impact happens, right? So it is termed as an situational crisis. So it occurs in response to sudden unexpected event in the person's life. This kind of the events which happens in the life of the person, it is a critical life event which happens, and it will revolve around the experiences of grief and loss. So a person, when he undergoes this kind of a crisis, it can result in grief or loss. He may have to undergo the grief process or the grief loss process. So when you take a situational crisis, it results, or we can say it is precipitated by unanticipated events which happens in the life of a person. This kind of events is going to create a disequilibrium in the person, which is going to threaten the person's sense of biological, social and the psychological integrity. So the overall, as a person, is biology, that means physically, okay, he may be affected. Psychologically, it can be a threatening situation, and socially also it is going to affect the person. So what are those examples of situational crisis, right? Which is very much unexpected event which happens in the life of the person. We have got the loss of job, divorce, abortion, death of the loved ones, severe physical or mental illness, premature birth, status and role changes, changes in the geographical location, and also poor performance in the school. So all these are the examples for the situational crisis. The next type of the crisis is the maturational crisis, or otherwise it is called as the developmental crisis or internal crisis. So what do you understand by the maturational or the developmental crisis? As the name says, so each and every stage of a life of a person is a developmental stage. So during the each developmental stage of life of a person, there is going to be some changes in or transition in the life expectations or in the responsibility of a person. Okay, say for example, when a child moves from the stage of childhood period to the adolescent period, lot of adaptations that a child may have to make. Or say for example, a person who has entered a retirement period, yes, from a employment period to a retirement period, right? So the age also is different, the responsibilities are lessened. Okay, so there are a lot of stressful things which happens from each stage of the development, especially when you take the adolescent period, or if you take a lady who is newly married, or a lady who is recently given birth as a mother. So responsibility of a mother is different, right? So all such situations wherein there is a development, or we can say a maturation, there is a transition from one stage to another, it requires some kind of the adaptation. It can become a stress for the person. So what is this maturational crisis? It is a predicted time of stress in everybody's life. So this kind of a maturational or developmental crisis is a predicted one. We can predict that it may become a stress for a person. So as I told you, it occurs due to response to a transition from one stage of the development to a next stage of the development. So a maturational crisis makes or requires a person to make some adaptation to the changes or adjustment to the changes and assume the responsibility patterns based on the change. So the individual may require to have a cognitive and behavioral change and also integrate those physical changes that accompany the development. So what is this? There should be an integration of the physical development, the behavioral development, as well as the cognitive development. Okay, say for example, an adolescent, right? From a child, a person becomes, or an individual becomes an adolescent. So if you take the physical, structure of an adolescent, there's a lot of change when you see from a child developing or maturing into an adolescent. You can see the physical changes. Along with the physical changes, there are some behavioral changes, or there are some cognitive changes which happens, right? So that is why there should be an integration of physical, psychological, or we can say the behavioral as well as the cognitive development. So a person to achieve a mastery in the particular task depends on the previous success, right? If a person feels, previously he has encountered such a situation and he has take it as a challenge and he is able to overcome the previous stage of development, even this one he will be able to overcome. So the success of the particular transition or a change which happens, it is mainly depending upon the previous success what a person has experienced, the availability of the support system. It can be the friends, it can be the family who are going to support them during the maturational crisis, and also the influence of the role models. So role models can be anybody. It can be a mother or a father, it can be a sister, whoever it is. So they follow what is being seen. So it can be the influence of the role model also which plays an important role in overcoming or leading to successful maturational crisis. and also acceptability of the new role and responsibility by others. Say for example, the family is not accepting the change which has happened, then definitely a person feels very difficult to cope up or to have a adaptation or adjustment to the developmental crisis. So success of the maturation crisis mainly depends upon the previous success which a person has achieved. It depends upon the availability of the support system, influence of the role model, as well as acceptance of the new roles by the other person. So what are these examples of the developmental or maturational crisis? So we have got examples like adolescent period, marriage, parenthood period, midlife period, as well as the retirement period. So these are the various important stages of development where actually there is a lot of transition which happens, okay, which requires a adaptation. The next type of the crisis is the socio-cultural crisis. So what do you understand by socio-cultural crisis? This kind of a crisis is not a part of everyday life situation, right? So this kind of a socio-cultural crisis will not happen every day. You can say it is not so common. So social crisis, when you take, social crisis is an accidental, uncommon, unplanned and unanticipated, and it results in the multiple loss and radial environmental change, right? Any kind of a social crisis you take, for example, we have got the natural disasters, hurricanes, flood, fire, earthquakes, war, riots, crime of violence, child abuse, rape, assault, bombing in crowded areas. So all these are examples of the social crisis. It will not happen every day. We can say, or we can say it as it is accidental, which is uncommon, unexpected and unplanned, which can result in the multiple loss. For example, if you have witnessed or seen the people who have underwent this crisis of flood, right? So they would have lost their property, they would have lost their loved ones, they would have lost their everything, multiple losses that a person would have experienced. So such a kind of a crisis is the social crisis. So when you take up this kind of a social crisis, the severity of the social crisis will be to a larger extent. It becomes very difficult for a person to use the usual coping mechanisms to cope up with the situation, because the person would have lost the support system itself, right? So say for example, as I told you, flood. So that kind of social crisis would have made a person to lose his family, to lose his property, to lose his home, multiple losses that he would have experienced. So to cope up with the loss, it takes very difficult for the person, because even he would have lost the support system, which is an important part for the coping up with the crisis. So this kind of a social crisis may require the help of the mental health professionals who can quickly act and provide services to the large number of the people who have experienced the similar situation. That means a community as a whole. So that is the time when we call upon the psychiatric department or the psychiatric nurses to come, intervene, to interact with the people, help them to overcome the grief process, give them the various counseling sessions and support them in all the ways so that they will be able to overcome. So that is the social crisis. The next type of crisis is a crisis resulting from traumatic stress. So what is this type of a crisis? So it is similar to that of a social crisis, wherein people would have has to face a lot of trauma in their life, right? It can be a rape, assault, child abuse, a bomb or a war or any kind of a robbery. So all such are the examples for the crisis situation which happens due to traumatic event. The next type of crisis is crisis resulting from psychopathology. So what is this crisis resulting from psychopathology? It is nothing but Previously, a person had one or the other psychiatric problem or psychological issue in him, right? So, such a kind of a psychological issue can make a person to become more prone to end up with a crisis situation. So, that is, if a person is associated with any other psychiatric, pathology or psychopathology, when he has to face any kind of a crisis situation, it can result in a difficult part for a person. So that is called as crisis resulting from the psychopathology. Say for example, a person is having a depression. He may go to such an extent that he can even have the self-destruction or in terms of suicide, right? So that is an example of a crisis because of the psychopathology. The next type is the adventitious or the community crisis. It is also similar to the social crisis. So community as a whole will be undergoing the crisis situation, especially the natural disaster which happens or a man-made disaster which a whole community has to face the crisis. So that is called as an adventitious crisis or a community crisis. So apart from that, even psychiatric emergencies are the crisis situation. So you have learned various psychiatric emergencies, right? So the suicide, or it can be the violent or excited kind of a behavior, withdrawal effects of a drug or alcohol. Okay, so like that, so many types of psychiatric emergencies that we have, it is also a crisis situation. So these are the various types of the crisis. So one can be a situational crisis or developmental crisis or social crisis or crisis because of psychopathology, or it can be adventitious or a community crisis or a psychiatric emergency itself. Moving on to the classes of emotional crisis. So we have got a person, Baldwin, who has identified 6 classes of the emotional crisis which progress by degree of severity. So a crisis is a situation which has got stages, we can say, okay, which keeps progressing to a stage of severity. So what are those 6 emotional crisis classes? Okay, class 1. So what do you mean by dispositional crisis? Is a acute response to an external emergency situation or acute response to an external situational stressor. Any kind of a stressor which comes from the external source, especially the situational crisis, is an example for a dispositional type of the crisis. So that is the first class. Second class, we have crisis of anticipated life transition. So it is nothing but a crisis which happens because of development or maturational crisis. So when you take a normal life cycle, so each life cycle requires some kind of a adaptation because of the transition which happens. So some of them may feel it difficult, or they may have a feeling of lack of control during the transition. So when such a crisis is there, it comes under the class 2, which is crisis of anticipated life transition. Class 3, crisis resulting from a traumatic stress. So what is this type of a crisis? So this kind of a crisis is again an unexpected type of the crisis which comes from the external source, for which an individual will not have a control. He may require an additional coping mechanisms to cope up with the situation. So all these classes are nothing but the types of the crisis, but Baldwin has given it as the classes. The next or the fourth class of the crisis is a maturational or the developmental crisis. So this type of a crisis is internal in origin. So maturational is from within an individual, right? So it is why it is internal in origin. It reflects the underlying developmental issues involving the dependency, value conflicts, sexual identity, control, and capacity of emotional intimacy. All these are related to the developmental or maturational crisis. The next one, we have class 5, crisis reflecting the psychopathology. So as I told you, any kind of pre-existing psychopathology, or if a person is having any kind of a behavioral emotional problem, so such a kind of a person, when he encounters a crisis situation, it becomes difficult for a person to cope up with it. Say for example, a person with schizophrenia or neurosis or any kind of anxiety disorder, so any kind of a depression, so all these are pre-existing psychopathology. So when a person experiences a crisis, then a person feels difficult to overcome. So that is what is crisis reflecting psychopathology. The last one, the sixth class, is the psychiatric emergencies. So it is a crisis situation wherein the general functioning of a person will be impaired and the individual will be unable to resume his personal responsibility. Say for example, we have got the suicidal individuals, or we have got patients who have got any kind of a overdose, or for example lithium toxicity, reactions to the hallucinosis, or acute psychotic conditions, uncontrollable anger, or the aggressive violent patient, or acute intoxication. So all these are the emergency situation which a person undergoes, can result in the crisis. So these are the various classes from class 1 to class 6 according to Baldwin. So these are the emotional classes of the crisis. Moving on to the signs and symptoms of the crisis. So you would have seen, or you yourself would have experienced any kind of a situation and crisis. So what are those signs and symptoms when you encounter a crisis situation? Obviously will become very much panic, right? So physically, mentally we are affected. Behavior also is getting affected because of the crisis. Yes, let us see what are the signs and symptoms. First thing, a person becomes very much anxious. He may become depressed. He may be agitated, restless, or he may show anger. He may have feelings of guilt, tension, fear. He may also neglect the self-care activities, finds very difficult to fulfill all his responsibilities or roles. He will use the unhealthy coping mechanisms. He will be very much irrational, and always he may blame others for the situation of the crisis. Overall, he'll be helpless, hopeless, and as well as useless, because he's having very much a panic situation. He will have the low self-esteem because he is not able to cope up with the situation. He will feel very much inferior, and that's why he'll have this symptom of low self-esteem, uncontrollable crying that you can see, lack of self-confidence, alteration in the sensorium can happen. He may become unconscious or semi-conscious, or he may have a syncope or a stuporous kind of a situation. He will have a disorganized way of thinking. Along with that, he can even have some physical illness. Previously, if he had any other medical disorders, that situation can become worsen or exacerbate those physical or medical problems. He'll be preoccupied with certain ideas. He'll be unable to maintain or follow the daily routine, even for that matter, as I told you, the self-care. Lack of self-control, impaired judgment he may have, hallucinations, as well as inappropriate relationships. Okay, so the relationship also can get hampered. So these are some of the signs and symptoms of the crisis. So in this particular video, I have explained what do you mean by crisis, what are the characteristics of the crisis, what are the various types of the crisis, and also the signs and symptoms of the crisis. Hope you all have understood the topic. In the next video, I'll be continuing the topic of crisis, wherein I'll be dealing with the resolution of crisis and what are the interventions, crisis intervention in detail. Hope you all have understood. Thank you.